Professor Gauker.
Yeah.
Hi. So, why is your book entitled Words Without Meaning?
Well, that title does create some misunderstandings. Sometimes people might think that I'm going to claim that language is pointless, or that my subject must be nonsense expressions like slithy toves. But I call it that to take a stand against a traditional or neo-traditional conception of the nature of linguistic communication that has a use for a certain theoretical conception of meaning. In calling my book Words Without Meaning, I'm denying that we should think of communication in terms of that theoretical conception of meaning. The traditional or neo-traditional conception of linguistic communication that I'm criticizing says that when a speaker says something, the speaker's intention is that the hearer will, on the basis of the speaker's choice of words, recognize that the speaker has in mind a thought with a certain propositional content or meaning. And the speaker expects the hearer to be able to do that by interpreting the speaker's words. The words themselves will, in a certain sense, have a meaning or express a propositional content, and the speaker expects that the hearer will infer that the meaning that the words have matches or is the same as the meaning or propositional content of the underlying thought in the speaker. And that theory of language has many problems, in my opinion, but one of the main ones is that if you explain language that way, then you have to posit a language-independent sort of mental representation. It has to be language independent so that we can, without circularity or without begging the question, explain the speaker's choice of words as the expression of such mental representations. And the problem with supposing that there are such mental representations is that no one has ever been able to explain what it takes for a thing in the brain to bear propositional content, have a meaning of the requisite sort. If you wanted to explain that, one of the first things you would have to do is explain the reference relation. You suppose that there's something in my brain that means dog, and that thing in my brain that means dog stands in the reference relation to doghood, or the set of all dogs that ever have been, are, and ever will be. And though many people have tried to explain what that reference relation is, I think that all of those attempts have failed quite badly. And so some of us should try to work out a conception of language in mind that does not commit us to explaining what that reference relation is.
Okay, but consider what we say. Sometimes we say, what do you mean, or what are you thinking? So there is a sense in which, it seems to me, that there is a sense in which words express thoughts. Don't you agree with that?
Well, that's what people often say to me. They say their theory, the neo-traditional theory, is common sense, and they take it to be common sense because we do talk that way. We ask people, what do you mean? We might criticize a person for not expressing his thoughts well. And I think that those ways of talking are perfectly useful, and we should have a theory of those ways of talking. We should have a semantics for a language that contains such modes of expression. Even I can use that phrase. But I don't think we should take those ways of talking as hinting at or revealing to us the fundamental theoretical entities in terms of which we should explain the nature of language and the nature of linguistic communication.
So, if I understood you correctly, when we say that words don't have meaning, what you mean is that we don't need to invoke the notion of mental representation in order to explain linguistic communication. So, what is your account? What is your alternative view on linguistic communication?
Well, that's a big question, of course. I think the first thing to say is that we need to distinguish between two projects. One project is the project of articulating what I call the norms of discourse. The other project is that of giving a psychological explanation of language, a psychological explanation of word choice, of language comprehension, of language learning. My book, Words Without Meaning, is primarily focused on the normative questions, the problem of articulating what I call the norms of discourse, roughly the rules of language. In my earlier book, 1994, Thinking Out Loud, I did have something to say about the psychology of language, and I intend to return to that subject in the future. As for the norms of discourse, my way of explaining those puts on center stage the concept of the context for a conversation. That's the key theoretical notion I need to explain. And the explanation of the concept of the context for a conversation has roughly two aspects. On the one side, I need to explain the formal structure of context. On the other side, I need to explain what it takes for a formal structure of that kind to be the one that pertains to a given conversation, the one relative to which we should evaluate the things that the interlocutors in that conversation say. Now, the formal structure of a context will depend on the logical resources of the language for which it is a context. In the simplest case, we might define contexts simply as sets of atomic sentences and negations of atomic sentences. But if the language contains quantifiers, then a context will also have to include a domain of discourse, or perhaps multiple domains of discourse. And a domain, for me, will be a set of demonstratives, also linguistic entities. If we want to do the semantics for a language that contains a conditional operator, then we will need to define contexts in such a way that they can, in a certain sense, contain other contexts. Anyway, given a precise characterization of the formal structure of a context for a language, we can then, for each logical connective, explain the conditions under which sentences formed with that connective are assertable in a context. And then, in terms of assertability in a context, we can define some of the important concepts that belong to the norms of discourse, such as the concept of logical validity. I would define a logically valid argument as an argument such that for every context in which the premises are assertable, the conclusion is assertable as well. The other half of the problem of explaining the nature of context, as I said, is to explain what it takes for one of these formal structures to be the one that pertains to a given conversation. Here I would talk about such things as the goals of the conversation and the way the world really is when the conversation takes place. I'm supposing that typically conversations have goals. These might be practical goals, such as hunting buffalo and killing them to eat them, or building a house. And the conversation is directed at achieving those goals. And we can say then that, and I suppose that some actions may accord with the context and other actions not accord with it. And then we can say very roughly that the context that pertains to a conversation is the one of those formal structures such that the interlocutors must act in accordance with it in order to achieve the goals of the conversation.
Some questions. When you use the word assertable in a context, you don't mean justified, don't you? And then, what is so good about defining logical validity in terms of assertability in a context?
Right. Well, other philosophers have used the term assertable to mean other things. Some have used it for the property that an assertion has when the speaker is epistemically warranted in making that assertion. And that's not what I mean. On the contrary, for me, assertability is, in a way, objective, in as much as the context for a conversation is objective. It's not determined by what the interlocutors have in mind. So, for example, if the conversation is a conversation about where to find buffalo, then one thing that may be assertable in the context is buffalo are near the lake. But the interlocutors may be misled by some tracks on the ground and not be in any position to assert buffalo near the lake. What is so good about defining logical validity in terms of assertability in a context? Well, there are negative virtues and there are positive virtues. The negative virtues are that it allows us to avoid certain problems. The usual definition of logical validity is this: an argument is logically valid if and only if, for every model or structure or interpretation on which the premises are true, the conclusion is true. Well, I think if you define logical validity that way, then you commit yourself to there being one special interpretation, call it the intended interpretation, such that truth on that interpretation is truth, truth simplicator. And then the question arises, well, which of all the possible interpretations of the language is the intended interpretation? And I think it's inevitable then that we will seek to explain that, to identify the intended interpretation in terms of the reference relation. We'll say that the intended interpretation is that which assigns to each name and each predicate the thing that it really refers to each name, the object that it refers to each predicate, the property or extension that it really refers to. And that brings us back to that intractable problem of explaining the nature of the reference relation. I claim that this problem is avoided on my definition of logical validity. But then there are also positive virtues. I claim that in terms of assertability in a context and the definition of logical validity in terms of assertability in a context, we can do a better job of characterizing the logic of natural language than we can do on the traditional model theoretic definition.
Do you have some examples?
Sure. Let me tell you a story. Suppose that Mary is the chair of a committee at her workplace. And the committee is gathered in the conference room, and as a way of getting the meeting started, Mary looks around and says, quote, "Everyone is present," unquote. Now, under the circumstances, I suppose we would regard her utterance as true. All of the committee members are present. They are the relevant people. So when she says everyone is present, that's true. But of course, not everyone in the universe is present. Vladimir Putin isn't present. So the sentence, "Vladimir Putin is present," is not true under those circumstances. I say that shows that the rule of universal instantiation is not valid for English. The rule of universal instantiation is a rule that you learn when you take elementary logic. It says that if you have a universally quantified sentence, you may drop the outer quantifier and put any name of the language in place of the resulting free variable. Well, if we drop the quantifier everyone and put the name Vladimir Putin in place of the implicit variable, the result is Vladimir Putin is present. But here we've seen that the premise, everyone is present, is true in some sense, and the conclusion, Vladimir Putin is present, is not true. So I say we have a counterexample to universal instantiation for English. But existential generalization is nonetheless valid.
I was going to ask you about that.
If we say Vladimir Putin is not present, if we commit ourselves to the truth of Vladimir Putin is not present, then we are equally committed to the truth of someone is not present. So universal instantiation is invalid, existential generalization is valid. I claim that we can better account for that pattern of invalidity by defining logical validity my way rather than in the usual model theoretic way.
It seems to me that at this point you might need three values, right?
Right. That's one problem. If our semantics is bivalent, if every sentence is supposed to be either true or false, then if existential generalization is valid, then assuming that we don't do anything unusual with negation, universal instantiation will have to be valid as well, whereas I've claimed that existential generalization is valid and universal instantiation isn't. Now, we can have various sorts of three-valued semantics within the framework of the classical model theoretic approach, but the usual occasions for recognizing lack of truth value don't apply here. Vagueness isn't involved, presupposition failure isn't involved, non-denoting terms aren't involved. I think that to capture this requirement for three values, we do better to define logical validity my way, though exactly why is a long story.
Sure. Okay, let's go back to your example. It's clear that not everybody will agree with you. Not everybody will consider what you gave me a counterexample to the rule of universal instantiation. And this is why. Well, someone might argue as follows. For example, might say that Mary's claim, everybody is present, is actually not true, is strictly speaking false, and therefore we don't have a counterexample because we don't have a case in which the premise is true and the conclusion is false. So what do you say to that?
Right. So the claim is that I haven't given you a counterexample because a counterexample would be a case in which the premise is true and the conclusion is false. But the sentence "everyone is present" is not strictly speaking true because, in the story I told, because not everyone in the universe is present. Well, to that I say, you can have your notion of strictly speaking true and strictly speaking false if you want, but we also need a different kind of truth and falsehood. We need a kind of truth that Mary's sentence has under those circumstances, a kind of falsehood that Mary's sentence lacks under those circumstances. And here's why. There are two ways in which Mary's sentence could be false, at least two. We could say that her sentence is false because Vladimir Putin isn't present. Not everyone in the universe is present. But we could also say that her sentence is false because not everyone on the committee is present. And it's really only falsehood of the second kind that would lead to objections, that would lead someone in the room to say, stop, it's not true. Well, if we need to distinguish between two kinds of falsehood, falsehood strictly speaking and falsehood in the ordinary sense, then we need to distinguish correspondingly between truth strictly speaking and truth in the ordinary sense. And we'll find that Mary's utterance has truth in the ordinary sense. And so there's a place for a logic of natural language that pertains to that truth in the ordinary sense. Although in the end I don't call it truth, but I call it assertability in a context.
Okay, you have a book about conditionals, so let me ask you something. Is if-then the material conditional, yes or not?
No.
Okay, why?
Why is if-then not the material conditional? Well, because there are arguments that we would consider to be invalid, but which would have to be characterized as valid if the English indicative if-then was the material conditional. That is, if we could explicate the meaning of if-then using the standard truth table that you learn in elementary logic for the conditional. Consider the following argument. Premise. If you throw switch A and you throw switch B, then the motor will start. Conclusion. Either if you throw switch A, then the motor will start, or if you throw switch B, then the motor will start. Now I say that that argument is invalid. The premise says, as it were, that throwing switch A and switch B is sufficient to start for the starting of the motor. The conclusion says that either the throwing of switch A is sufficient or the throwing of switch B is sufficient for the starting of the motor, but that doesn't follow. But if we interpreted the English indicative conditional as the material conditional, then we would have to count that argument as valid. But it's not valid. So the English indicative conditional is not the material conditional.
So how do you explain for the invalidity of the argument?
Well, that's a long story, but I can get the idea across, I suppose. So, consider the possibility that a context might, in a certain sense, contain other contexts. So we might speak of all of the contexts that are in or identical to a given context. Now suppose the premise, if you throw switch A and you throw switch B, then the motor will start, is assertable relative to such a context. I take it that that means that for every context in or identical to the context in question, in which the sentence, you throw switch A and you throw switch B, is assertable, the sentence, the motor will start, is assertable. But even if that's assertable in the context, it might not be the case that for every context in which the sentence, you throw switch A, is assertable, the sentence, the motor will start, is assertable, and also not the case that for every context in or identical to the context in question in which the sentence, you throw switch B, is assertable, the sentence, the motor will start, is assertable. So the conclusion, either if you throw switch A, then the motor will start, or if you throw switch B, then the motor will start, may not be assertable in that context.
And that's how you explain invalidity.
The invalidity.
I see. Let's go back to psychology, and more precisely to folk psychology. According to many philosophers, people have beliefs and desires, and it's in light of what they believe and what they desire that we can actually successfully explain their behavior and predict their behavior as well. But you don't agree with this picture. Why not?
Well, I agree that we can explain behavior in terms of beliefs and desires. I just don't think that's the fundamental function of the attribution of beliefs and desires. You're right. The prevailing view, call it even a dogma, is that when we attribute beliefs and desires to a person, what we're doing is positing a theoretical entity precisely for the sake of explaining and predicting their behavior. The idea is that we can observe what they do, on that basis infer that they have certain beliefs and desires,